Are you ready to branch out, to take a leap of faith, to love yourself and others fully? Then let go of whatever no longer serves you to take action now on Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills, living it up, loving it up, and letting it go. Erica will energize and excite you to power up your passionate dream that sets your soul on fire. With Erica's E3 approach, equipping, empowering, and enlightening yourself so you can be yourself for yourself. Get ready and get rooted to live a life without regrets, without what ifs, without should haves, and especially without empty feelings from a life unexplored. This hit show helps you build powerful and intentional roots to live it up, love it up, and let it go. Get fearlessly ready and powerfully rooted in your yes with your host, Erica Gifford Mills, and be fearless about your more and stand in your yes. Now on Get Rooted Radio.
Welcome, everyone. I am Erica Gifford Mills, and you are listening to Get Rooted Radio, living it up, loving it up, letting it go, right here on Transformation Talk Radio. A big shout out, as always, to my producer today, Emily. Emily, how are you doing?
I am doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Can you believe it's February?
It came so fast.
It did. I mean,
Too fast.
I know January is usually 750 days long, and this year it just flew past. So I don't know if that's a sign of good things to come and things moving along, but that also means we're entering the month of love. And, you know, whether you are single, in a relationship, contemplating a relationship, or just out of a relationship, it is the month of love. And the best love you can give is to yourself. And one way to show yourself and others that you love you is to set appropriate boundaries. And today, that is what our episode is all about. Today, we are going to learn how to harness the power of assertiveness to build and maintain healthier, safer relationships, both personally and professionally. And my guest today, Cara Tuttle, and I will discuss the potential and limits of boundary setting, how assertiveness differs from aggressive and passive-aggressive behavior, and the benefits of incorporating assertive communication into our daily lives. But first, a bit about my guest, and I'm so honored to have her back on the show. I've had the honor of being a speaker with her in a couple different times, and she is absolutely wonderful. So you're in for a nice treat. Cara Tuttle is a speaker, author, consultant, and an activist-minded educator with nearly 20 years experience working in higher education. Cara is the author of Drowning in Timidity, Women, Politeness, and the Power of Assertive Living, and has contributed chapters to various books and publications, including The Future Female Leader, Preparing Girls and Women to Lead the World, The Female Code, a woman's book for empowerment and confidence, The Professional Woman, Pivoting to the New Normal, and Raising Daughters, Raising Healthy Children in an Unhealthy World. Cara has become an influential and award-winning leader in addressing sexual harassment and assault in higher education, and frequently speaks on assertiveness and boundary setting, as well as other issues relating to the empowerment of women. Thank you so much for being on the show today with us.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be back.
And I'm looking forward to really, this is one of my favorite topics. And I talk about it a lot because I don't think we can ever get enough of it. And it's not something that you do once and then it just always sticks. It's as you change in life, as your experiences change, as the world changes, it's something with assertiveness as well as boundary setting that we have to reapply really on a daily basis. So the first part I want to get into with you is really what it is assertiveness. What do you mean by that?
I love that question, actually, because people are bringing so many ideas and some myths and misinformation just when the word comes up, right? So something came to mind for the listener, and that's probably a bunch of different things. But by assertiveness, I mean we're showing up, we're being direct, we're being clear, we're being fair, we are communicating, okay? So we're not engaging aggressively or passively or passive-aggressively, but somewhere in the middle, if you think of it as a spectrum, I like the triangle. There are different diagrams for assertiveness, but that's how we're showing up more often than not. But as you said, it is a daily practice, and the more you engage in it, the easier it becomes until it becomes your new normal.
And I think that is really so important because, and I think it's funny because when you hear assertive, what's the one word that people automatically go to? is aggressive, right? So how does it differ from engaging aggressively?
So I think a lot of people do think of it as aggression, and it's really important to know the difference, because one is going to take you further in your personal relationships, in your career, and one is eventually going to hold you back. Now, we see plenty of examples where people are engaging aggressively, and that can be a couple of different things. That can be taking up too much space, taking up too much time. That can be volume. So they're louder in meetings. They might interrupt people in meetings. They are always advancing their agenda. And there was a real, 1980s pop culture, celebration of aggressiveness in the workplace. And so some of us grew up with that. And it can be normalized in Western cultures, but we want to move away from the clawing your way up to the top and every man for himself idea, and settle back into assertiveness, which is, yes, showing up and doing what I'm here to do, whether it's in the meeting or engaging for what is fair to me within a personal relationship, but we're not trampling the rights of others. And so it's a fairer practice. It can be incorporated into activism, in work for justice. It's useful in mediations or negotiations, but it also means we're not necessarily compromising everything away, because sometimes we have boundaries that aren't that negotiable, and that's okay too.
Yeah, and I think that's important when it's collaboration without giving up what is you, what's your essence, right?
Right.
And I think that's that fine line sometimes, is when you're promoting yourself, when you are getting, I want to say agenda out there, because this is what matters to me. And to what point have you gone too far? And I think, I know personally, I've crossed that lines on occasion, right? And I think that's partly my, the day job of being in compliance is sometimes that line between assertive and aggressive is like, no, you gotta do it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, right? But it's practicing. And I think that assertiveness training is very important, because there are times, depending on your mood, right? Maybe you've had a bad day, maybe you didn't get enough sleep, that it is easier to cross that line. And I think it's also, you said Western culture, and I think there is a difference between genders. And so how and why does gender matter when it comes to assertive communication?
Yes, well, I also love this question, because it unfortunately still matters a lot, because we are gendering the way we interpret other people's body language, tone of voice, and we all are, right? We have some norms that we expect. We have some bias, and sometimes that's implicit or unknown to us, operating under the surface. Sometimes it's explicit, and that still exists, even though in polite society, I have groups that want to pretend that it does not, but it does, right? So it really depends, who's sitting on the other side of the table, how you're going to tailor your message, because some audiences understand what assertiveness is, and that a woman showing up assertively does not automatically turn it into aggressiveness, but some audiences don't. So we're not interpreted the same way, even today, even in 2024, right? It's like we have not made that much progress. So it is important to know that people are still expecting, doesn't mean we should do it, but some people are still expecting women to be more pleasant at all times. And I'm all for pleasantries and politeness when appropriate, but not at the expense of my needs or my wants or well-being or my agenda. I like the word agenda. I always have an agenda. I have an agenda when I go into every meeting, but that limit, is selfishness, and that's when it can spill over into aggressiveness. But we have just tolerated a lot of boorish behavior by men in the workplace for some time, that women are not extended the same space or grace to engage that way. It's important to know that, right? So I don't want us to tailor everything necessarily to the sexism we might experience, but the more we're preparing ourselves for our meeting, for persuading others, for whatever it is that we're trying to do, the more we have to think about the ways in which our message might be being interpreted in a gendered or stereotyped lens.
And it's not just the sexes against each other. I mean,
No. Oh, no.
women do it to other women, men do it to other men, and vice versa.
Yes.
So making sure, listeners, we're not pitting the sexes against each other by any means, but it is. And we, as you said, the implicit or explicit, how many times have you, read a text and you're like, well, what does she mean by that? Because you're reading a tone into it, right? Where there is no tone. And you don't know, that person might have been, I don't want to be rude and not reply. I need to get a message out. But then they say, okay, great. And then, well, what did you mean by okay, great? Like, so then
Absolutely.
you have to stop with that thinking, especially in the communication. And I think it is all about communicating. And we'll get into it for sure later, but it is, if we can't assume what others people are thinking, feeling, or how they're going to react, even if you've worked with them for 20 years, because they could be trying to change as well. They could be trying to open up. And that's where we need to make sure that we do allow for that communications. So we're gonna probably take this quick break, because I don't want to get into the next part yet, and I feel like I'm going to go there, but we're going to talk about the benefits of assertiveness in the next segment. But before we go, tell folks how they can reach you, and you have a freebie today for listeners. How can they get that?
Thank you. Yes. So you can find me online. I'm in a number of different places. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. My books are available at my website, which is caratuttlebell.com. Also available on Walmart or Amazon for free on Kindle if you have Kindle Unlimited. But at caratuttlebell.com, I have put some freebies up for your listeners. They're under downloads, but I'll put a message right that pops up at the beginning so you can find your way right to those.
Wonderful. So you are listening to Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills. Living it up, loving it up, letting it go. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills. Living it up, loving it up, letting it go. If you missed any portion of today's episode, you can catch it on getrootedradio.com. That's getrootedradio.com. Don't forget to subscribe online to receive the latest news, events, specials, and words of encouragement. Go to getrootedradio.com. Welcome back to my guest, Cara Tuttle. Cara, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
So during the last segment, we talked about assertiveness training and how to make sure that we're doing this on a daily basis so that we don't cross that line over to aggressiveness. But this segment, we will be really getting into why assertiveness is good for us, right? So essentially, why? What are the costs of not engaging assertively?
The costs are high. And the costs can be convincing to people. I like to talk about both the costs and benefits of engaging assertively. We know, because we live the cost of not engaging assertively. You go home, you're still chewing on whatever was bothering you. You might be thinking about it for days. You finally, on the third day, come up with the thing you wish you had said, right? It might have impacted your appetite. It might have impacted your sleep. It might have affected your mood and the way you engage with others. There are so many short-term disadvantages to not engaging assertively, but there's also some long-term harms, right? So the more passive or passive-aggressive we are, the less our needs are getting met, the more we're wanting from others and feeling unheard. This can build resentment, anxiety, depression that results in those changes to appetite, so we can have healthy or unhealthy coping mechanisms with this kind of stress. But a lot of people do have insomnia. Then they have all this apprehension going into whenever you have that next conversation with someone or that next meeting, and you get trapped in this cycle where if you had engaged assertively or addressed the situation when you're ready, it's not always like, jumping out of your mouth. I want you to think before you communicate, but not letting that much time lapse between those assertive and very necessary conversations can pull us out of the disadvantages into reaping some of the advantages.
Yeah. And I think that's important because you said, you might have had this meeting and then 2 days later, maybe you're having a follow-up meeting and you're so caught up in, I'm going to be sure I say this time, that you're not actually listening. It's that overarching communication problem that a lot of us have is we listen to respond, we don't listen to hear. And we aren't set up to actually respond in the assertive manner. You can lose that because now you're just too busy. I'm going to make sure I make my point this time. I'm going to make sure I got to make sure I get this in. And that's where you do come across more aggressive because you might be interrupting. You might be, I need to say this, before they're done because I got to do it. And it's hard, right? Because you want to make sure your point gets across, but then you lose that whole, then your point doesn't necessarily get across because they're not listening to it because maybe now you're being aggressive versus assertive.
Right. And also the thing you were worried about might not have actually bothered them at all, right? So you've lost the other, 49 minutes of the meeting because you've been like focused on this thing right here. And some of it could be fixed really quickly, but you also don't want to lose the opportunity to weigh in on whatever the rest of the conversation was, right? And so I love that you raised that, and I love that you're going back to communication because that is really what we're talking about. It's a method of communication. You can take your time. If you think of the amazing thing 3 days from now, you can have that conversation, right? So also, I just like to remind people we have more time than you think, but also the more you practice it, the easier it will be to generate the fair and assertive response, which also might be, can we come back to this? Or can we pause for a second? It's just not letting it pass and let someone else drive the train, so to speak, right? You have a right to be there and to engage. And you can set the tone of the meeting or the conversation in a way that enables you to participate. That's part of what we're talking about too.
And I think it's important when you said, come back to this or pause. And even if at the moment you're not thinking about it, but maybe after the meeting, you start replaying, maybe you're like looking at your notes at the end of the day and then you start replaying, and it's okay to say, I was thinking about our conversation and I do have some more questions, or I didn't think about this at the time, and bring something up even after the fact, because you're not trying to rehash something. You're realizing, you know what? I didn't say I don't want to say 2 cents, but I didn't say my 2 cents because I didn't think about it. But if you don't do that, you are going to continuing to think about it, because then I wish I would have done that. I've done it, I don't know, so many times in the middle of the night. I'm like, oh, that would have been a great response. And so I write it down, right? I'm like, okay, this is great because I didn't think about that. Or there are times where I don't think about something until all of a sudden, oh, how is that going to affect it? So I'll write it down so I remember. And then I will go back saying I was thinking about this and want to go back to what we were talking about yesterday or the day before or last week, whenever it was. And if you do it in a right way, it's not the rehashing, right? It's not that's professionally, right? And even with friends, right? You could have been thinking about something, or maybe a friend's going through a difficult time and you aren't sure what to say to them because you don't want them to be mad, but you do want to give them some good advice, and you can go back. Or it's not like you're rehashing a fight from 3 years ago, right?
No, but if you need to, you can.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
It's an opportunity to show that you are compassionate and that you're taking something seriously. In the workplace, I don't ever mind to hear if members of my team are still thinking about a conversation we had a few days ago. That demonstrates some dedication to me, that they want to solve a problem. So there's really a lot of opportunities, and it is ongoing, and it is a cycle. And sometimes I hear advice about letting things go, and that doesn't necessarily resolve all our issues. Sometimes we're not actually letting it go, right? Like we're holding on to it, and we're really resentful that we're the one expected to either always be the bigger person, or always be the pleasant person, or always be the person who lets things go. And so engaging assertively and kind of reframing yourself that that's going to be your practice is a great way to restore balance to those relationships, and better advocate for yourself and your issue, your agenda, your needs and wants, whatever it is.
Right. No, and I think that's important because if we aren't engaging in that assertive behavior, right, it will affect our sleep, as you said, right? You'll have anxiety every time you go into a media meeting with that person, or if it's a family member that you see a couple times a year, every time you're in front of them. And then that could affect other relationships, because now you have this animosity because you maybe didn't speak up, right?
Right.
And I think that sometimes, and I know we'll get into it in boundary setting, is, you start getting upset, you have resentment, but it could have all started from you because you weren't getting your message clearly across, because maybe you weren't speaking up. And again, I'm not trying to put it all on that person. We all have dealt with individuals who are very good at being manipulative or a little narcissistic. But if we aren't actively engaging in those assertive conversations and putting ourselves, our wants and needs, and expressing ourselves, we have some, skin in the game here.
We do. It's about controlling what we can control, right? So those annoying or offensive or problematic people are going to be in our world, right? I mean, that's the nature of humans. We're going to interact with these humans, and it's not meant to condone their behavior. And sometimes I'm working with people who are overly aggressive and kind of need to tone it down. It's not just about stepping up. And it's not that I want to excuse any of that problematic behavior. I don't. But I do want to evaluate where they are, like in terms of their career or like an organizational hierarchy. How can we help them get where they want to go, right? So it's about engaging strategically and exercising restraint strategically and pleasantries strategically. It's not always about assuming a weaker position, which sometimes people think or they hear that at first where they're like, no, I'm not going to let it go. And I'm like, but is it getting you where you want to go? Like, are you winning at the end of the day if you engage assertively over here or passive aggressively over here, which is many people's favorite tool, but does not bring us much reward either.
And I think that is, there's a time and a place, right? And how do you manage up when you see maybe it's somebody higher up, on how do we help them with that without getting ourselves into a situation on, are you telling me how to? But I think that is, you're correct. There are times where sometimes being pleasant is the best thing. And I've done it on, if I say anything right now, it's not going to come across the way I want it to. So as you said earlier, pause. Let me take a breath, because anything I say right now is not going to go well. And I hear that they're not listening. Right. So I'm not going to waste my energy and just get more frustrated and upset and that emotion, because then you have emotion in it.
Yeah. It's not worth your energy at that time, right? It actually isn't worth your energy at that time. It could be better timed. And really the tactic is designed to be persuasive for you, to get your goals accomplished and get you where you want to go.
So there definitely is, ladies and gentlemen, assertiveness is good for you. So, right, it's efficient, clear, fair, respectful, right? Personally and professionally, because everybody wants those things in your personal lives as well, not just professional. And we can reduce those common things, anxiety, depression, frustration, the unhealthy coping mechanisms when we aren't engaging. But as we said, there is a kind of a time and a place when we need to do that. So let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to discuss the power of boundary setting. But before we go, tell listeners how they can reach you.
You can find me online and on Instagram and LinkedIn. But I have all of my information collected at caratuttlebell.com, and that's where you can buy the book or access free downloads and other resources.
Thank you, Cara. I am Erica Gifford Mills, and you are listening to Get Rooted Radio, living it up, loving it up, letting it go. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. We're back on Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills. Living it up, loving it up, letting it go. Don't forget to visit getrootedradio.com to listen to a replay of this episode, sign up for helpful tips, and learn about upcoming events. That's getrootedradio.com. Welcome back to my guest, Cara Tuttle. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. Happy to have this conversation.
It is. I love it. It's my favorite because it's so important. Especially when we get into this segment, the power of boundary setting. I think I've been always very good at times, not always. I've definitely had my issues, but this past year, I found I had to reevaluate my boundaries. What was okay, maybe in 2022, in the beginning of 2023, I learned quite quickly that I can't still set some of those same boundaries because I just physically couldn't do them. And so there is so much power in boundary setting. And so I think, and some people think, well, what does assertiveness and boundary setting, why are you talking about both of those now? That doesn't make sense. And I'm like, oh yeah, it does. Trust me. So why do assertiveness and boundary setting go hand in hand?
You really can't have one without the other. I know sometimes at first glance, people wonder why, like in my day job where I'm focused on sexual harassment prevention, why sometimes I'm giving presentations on assertiveness or persuasiveness or speaking with authority. And it's not like the obvious choice, like bystander intervention or consent education. Those are our most frequent and our most directly connected programs. But you can't do anything effectively in this issue. Resistance strategies, helping a friend, addressing behavior. You can't change the way people treat you or engage in risk reduction. You can't change your relationships. You can't advance your career. You can't do any of these things without some assertiveness. So I really like both. And, I have different people who come to different programs. We have a program called Boundary Setting. We have the Assertiveness program. Sometimes they come, but there's definitely overlap, in those presentations and in those conversations, because you need both for them to work effectively over time. And they will change. It is in flux. I love your intro, because that's a perfect point to remember, is that what I've put in place for myself this year, with this person, it might change over time. How I've engaged has changed over time as I've changed jobs or I've advanced in my career. I had different roles to fill. I was in my last job, which is now several years ago, but my role there was really to make my director's life easier, But then when I came in charge of the center that I now lead, I had to be much more assertive almost overnight, because I was the designated voice on this issue on my college campus, right? And it was exhausting. I hadn't been in that gear nonstop. It was exhausting year one to keep inserting myself in a conversation with people who had been used to me not being in that conversation. I have a job that was newly created, so there wasn't this role on campus, but it was really a time where I had to push myself out there and engage, but also set boundaries too, because it just became so crucial for a lot of reasons about here's who I am, here's what my center is about, here's what we will address, here's what somebody else's work is, here are how many hours I have in the day, here is when you can reach me, but also here is how I will stand for you talking to me, and here's how I'm not willing, to be spoken to in a professional setting, right? So it was the first few years in my current role were quite the journey. And I'd always cared about this, and I'd read about this, and I'd been working, on myself, but really the expansion of my study of assertiveness became necessary if I was to do the job that I have effectively. And the connection between assertiveness and boundary setting just became so apparent, in my personal life, but it really does in this niche area of work that I have, and then I can take it and apply it elsewhere, right? So it's not that every conversation is about sexual assault or sexual harassment prevention. A lot of our lives, hopefully, is not focused on that. And we can take lessons, though, from what we've learned in those strategies to apply it to hopefully much safer settings and control what we can control again. And there's sometimes we can't. Some people are just really intent on violating our boundaries. But when we can set boundaries to create these limits, around ourselves and for ourselves, then we can not let things get out of hand when we can control that and hopefully be in healthier, safer spaces.
Yes, and a great point. I mean, because I think that is really important to understand, is that we sometimes get into situations where maybe if we were a little bit more assertive, maybe if we spoke up, we wouldn't. And I think many times, not of course all the times, because as you said, there are people who are just intent on crossing over the boundaries, or there are a lot of takers out there, right? They don't have that mindset. But I think many times people don't mean to cross boundaries. What they think is what is okay for them is maybe not okay for you or I or somebody else. And because that's never been communicated. I mean, I think of people giving each other hugs, right? And, some people are huggers and they go up and hug somebody and everyone's like, well, because they didn't ask, right? They just assumed it's, I love them. You got to love them. And if you don't say anything, but then you're upset with that person because they hugged you, did you say, no, I'm not a hugger, or no, thank you, right? And
Right.
If we don't communicate, if we don't communicate and keep those boundaries on a regular basis, then how is anybody else to know? We can't assume that my values, my boundaries, my everything is the same as yours. Even if we grew up in the same household, it doesn't matter. And I think that's important for us to realize for ourselves, like, did I just cross somebody's boundary that I didn't even realize? Or did they know that was a boundary of yours because you've let them cross that line all this time? That doesn't mean you can't make them stop, but you've allowed it, and now you're mad at them because
Right.
now I'm having this, resentment. Well, what are we doing with that?
Right. It's like, that's the space of tension,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be the serious types of encounters that I've mentioned, in my line of work. It can be the relationship with your mother-in-law, for example. If she is used to coming over unannounced and letting herself in, and this bothers you because that's a boundary, like maybe in your family, everyone calls ahead, texts ahead, knocks on doors. Those assumptions might be there. You might find that really rude or invasive, but I suggest you have that conversation early on rather than 5 years into the relationship, because then it's going to be hard to change. It's not impossible. Okay, so it's never too late. That's an important thing to know when we're talking about both assertiveness training and boundary setting. It's never too late, but put yourself on the other side, right? This is called empathy mapping, where we think about how the message is being interpreted and how we can be persuasive to get people to do what we want. So you got to think about mother-in-law, for example, who's used to just coming over, feeling very welcome, what her feelings are going to be, what tension that might put on your relationship, how to craft that message so you can institute a boundary that maybe didn't exist before, so that you're not carrying that resentment for, say, 20 years instead of 5.
Yes, absolutely. And so how do we practice those boundary settings, right? How do we do that, especially if we've never done it before, or maybe we're not very good at it, or like you said, in those cases where you've allowed it for this long, and again, you can still set it. It's not that that's not weight, but we can still set it. So how do we do it? How do we go about it?
It is difficult to start, and I really feel for you. And it's so interesting when I have workshops, because I have some people, women especially, not always women, but women especially, again, because there's been that expectation and that socialization to be pleasant and polite, to not ruffle feathers, to not create conflict, that does tend to still be gendered somewhat, where people tell me they can't do it. And you can do it. You can do it, and we'll just start as small as it needs to be. I mean, I have people start as small as, if you are walking across anywhere, navigating the world, and you are walking down a sidewalk, sometimes there's this little game of chicken that occurs about who's going to move. And I don't want you to crash into humans. That's not what we're doing. But you can have this own solitary, no one has to know you're doing it, assertiveness assessment or practice where you figure out who you are. Are you the person who always moves out of the way, and why? Or when you're on a plane, are you the person who never gets an armrest, and why? Right? Do you deserve an armrest? Yes. Are you always taking the middle seat? What? So I like tools like that. There's some in my book. There's some available online. So you can definitely find them. These like assertiveness questionnaires or quizzes. It's going to help you figure out where we're starting, because some people might be starting at that very basic level. One quick practice that anyone can do, and it's more painful than it sounds, is say no to someone without explaining it or without apologizing for your no. Then
No, it's
that'll
a
help you
full
really-
sentence.
No,
It's
can
a
be a
full sentence. Yes.
I mean, I love it. We're on the same page, but definitely, I was much more timid when I was younger. So this has been a journey for me, and I get it. But this feels good once you start doing it. It actually does.
Yes. And I think it's, that's really important, because sometimes we feel that whether it's business, whether it's personal, we feel like we have to give an excuse why we say no. And sometimes it's just, no, thank you for the invite though.
Yeah. You can be pleasant around your no.
Yeah. But it doesn't have to always be an explanation. And I think that's a great test, is why do we feel like we need to give an explanation, right? And I think those tests will kind of level set you on, where am I at? And then what can I do to move forward? So before we go to break, one last question. What are the limits of boundary setting?
The limits of boundary setting, you have to know, and I'm over here like being visual about it, is like, you have a boundary that is you, an extension of your space, right? Your wants and your needs belong to you. You have to know that this is not a magic solution to get you everything you want, that some people also have their rights and their space, and they can disagree with you, and they can also say no. So this is a form of communication that hopefully better positions you to be heard and understood, but not necessarily translate into a yes on everything that you want, right? So there are those limits in that we're dealing with other humans who have rights, wants, and needs the same as us, and we're hoping for some agreement there, but it might not always come.
Yeah. And that's important to know, right? Because it's not always just about me, or not always just about you. We have to have that, in between, right? We have to have that collaboration, and sometimes I'm drawing a blank at the word.
Like compromise or
compromise. That's the word I'm looking for. Because it is, right? In any relationship, business, professional, there is a little bit of that. It's just how much do you do before you give up your entire self? So, well, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to discuss your relationship with anger and why it should be reconsidered. This is Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills. Living it up, loving it up, letting it go. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills. Living it up, loving it up, letting it go. If you missed any of the information during the last segments, go to getrootedradio.com. That's getrootedradio.com to listen to the replay. Don't forget to subscribe, sign up for tips and special events, and pricing for upcoming coaching sessions at getrootedradio.com. Welcome back to my guest, Cara Tuttle. Cara, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Erica. I'm happy to be here.
So tell listeners how they can learn more about you, your services, your books, and reach out if they would like any more information.
Yeah, thank you. My website is caratuttlebell.com. I'm also on Instagram at Cara Tuttle and LinkedIn at Cara Tuttle. The books are available on Walmart and Amazon, and also from my website. So there's a couple different ways to find me.
Wonderful. So during today's episode, we've talked about assertiveness, its benefits, as well as the power of boundary setting. And this last segment, we want listeners to reconsider their relationship with anger. Explain what you mean by this, Cara.
I do like anger, and I like to talk about anger, as you know. I have many counselor friends, and they have this diagram of the emotions wheel, and they tell me you're not supposed to like this side of it so much, but I do, and I think it's got a bad rap, and it's underutilized. So what I mean by this is, I think that we're taught to suppress our anger or be afraid of our anger, and that we need to control our anger. And so there's all of this preoccupation and nervousness about anger, where we're not necessarily comfortable sitting in it, and we're not listening to all the messages that it's trying to tell us. So I don't, of course, want anyone to be so angry they're living in bitterness and resentment again, on this other side, but you can have it, like, let it come up and let it talk to you, and ask yourself, why am I feeling so angry? And we've all had that. Sometimes we are maybe irrationally angry about this thing, and can't let that go. There are messages for you in there, but often anger is signaling a boundary violation. And that is going to be when you need to think of an assertive response. That's the best tool usually for that, but it also can tell you when maybe an aggressive response is appropriate. In limited circumstances, I want you to have a firm boundary that you might need to communicate aggressively. And anger, when it's, in a healthy space, should be proportional to what's going on and send you some messages that help inform your next steps. So I want us to actually be angrier about a lot of things, and less pleasant about all of those inconveniences, slights, microaggressions, discrimination, harassment, these things that are far too common, especially in women's lives, and trust the messages that anger are giving us, and then use it as a cue to really, assert ourselves and engage in that boundary setting that I think is really key.
And I think you're talking about channeling it, right? Using it for good. And
yes,
it's very different than what you were talking about, but yet somewhat the same. Like there were times over the past year I'm angry, and I still am at times, but I get angry. I, maybe go to my Wave Master, do a few hits and kicks, probably that's all I can do anymore, and let it out. But then I try to channel that anger into, now let's work on getting healthy. Let's work on getting better. Let's do what I need to do. And I think at first, when I was trying to not be angry and be Miss Polly Pleasant and just, it is what it is. I mean, it's true. Cancer is what it is, but I just not let my feelings, right? You got to feel the feelings and let them go. Don't unpack and stay there, but move through it. But how can we learn to channel our anger into assertiveness?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, the framing is important, because that is exactly what I do. So, again, my day job, my job is addressing sexual harassment, and I've chosen this and I love it, but I am angry all of the time. And I think that's rightfully so, and audiences always laugh when I say that, but then they understand. But the reaction I get when I ask people to reclaim their anger is always a little laughter with some hesitation. But the channeling of it is key. You're channeling it somewhere. It's not that you're not having an angry response ever in life. I mean, some days I channel it into like chips and salsa that I'm eating very aggressively, but I'm trying to view anger as fuel. And I like what you mentioned, because a workout is a great release of anger that lets you process it and then think about, okay, here's what I'm angry about. Here are the steps I'm going to take to deal with this. That's where assertiveness comes in, because you probably are going to have to assert yourself to put those steps into action. This works for activism. This works for me as, having strategies in the workplace during a meeting, for an annual report. It can be short and long term, but it is really key that you let yourself have the feeling and engage in the mental processing, mental or physical stress relief to let the steam off, and I mean, I find time with my, girlfriends to be key. I didn't used to think of it as an important part of my week, right? An occasional happy hour or debrief time or coffee or whatever it is, but it is actually key where I'm like having a space to vent that is a safe space. So I'm not bursting, out with aggression in a meeting. I have let off some steam to my friends in a non-professional setting where anything, goes, and we love each other and we just take turns. And then I've had time to collect my thoughts, take the deep breaths. Deep breaths are your friends here, and then figure out what it is to do. So that's really how I've, learned to deal with it. But some of this I did have to learn the hard way. There were a few years where I felt really burnt out and really deflated about creating change as quickly as I wanted. And some people leave the profession, and if you need to for your well-being, I understand that, but I didn't want to leave yet. I had more things that I wanted to accomplish. So I had to figure out how to have a longer term strategy to deal with, these pressures. And the boundary setting became key. And we've talked about some big boundaries, but also, I was not eating lunch a lot of times where I was losing track of my day and getting pulled in so many different directions that I was either not eating or eating at like 3 o'clock. And now I'm much stricter as I can be. There's some flexibility in it, but much stricter about like, okay, I'm gonna try to block the noon hour for myself to eat quietly in my office because I'm actually an introvert. I need to have some energy recovery time, and I do work during the hour, but it's not in this rush setting where I'm grabbing something salty that's not really, good for me. Everybody's diet is different, but that is key then to me functioning in the next few hours of the day. That was a simple boundary that I learned to put in place as I was figuring out how to channel my frustrations and my anger, big and small, in my career so that I could stay in this job, which I'm still in now. Like 8 years later, I'm still doing it and I still like it. And that's,
and I think that's
setting key. Yeah.
Yeah. What I hear you saying is that's what we gain by becoming more angry, right? We do have that healthier life, right? The more authentic life.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Cara, so much for being on the show today. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And I know this is one of our both of our favorite topics is boundary setting and assertiveness. So thank you so much for being on the show. And I look forward to seeing you in August.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This was fun again.
Good. So I want to thank you all for tuning in to Get Rooted Radio. If you missed any part of today's episode or want to listen again, go to getrootedradio.com for the podcast. And don't forget to tune in the first and third Monday of each month at 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central, and 2 p.m. Pacific right here on Transformation Talk Radio. Thank you for tuning in. Have an amazing day. And I'm looking forward to the next time on Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills. Living it up, loving it up, letting it go. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills, living it up, loving it up, and letting it go. Visit getrootedradio.com if you have missed any part of this hit show, and tune in on transformationtalkradio.com to live fearlessly in your more and powerfully rooted in your unlimited yes. For more information and to work with Erica directly, visit getrootedradio.com. That's getrootedradio.com, and get ready to live it up, love it up, and let it go.